My name is Hassan Nawash, and I was born in Ankara. I experienced the Nakba firsthand. It happened when I was 6. And I remember after Deir Yassin, my father and my uncles came from the front. They were on guard in Karam with the rest of the young people. They load us the next morning on a flatbed truck and with some bedding to go to my aunt's house in over about 2-3 miles away. And I remember that night there were about 30 people, because there were 3 families. My uncles, there were no men, they were all children and women. And I was at night sleeping on the sardine line. And I remember there was this 13-year-old or so woman, or young woman, who was in the middle of the night trying to go to the bathroom, and she actually stepped on me. And I was terrified. I was just like, I thought she was going to crush me. It just, you know, my aunt was very, very hospitable, very giving, very loving, and funny too. And she had to put up with all these people for about 4 days. And then when it became clear that this is not any longer a safe place, I guess they loaded us through Jerusalem on some armored vehicles in order to go to Jericho. And then from there, they loaded us to Salt, and the east part of Jordan. And it seems like I don't know, it's hard for me to stay away from analysis as I'm telling the story, because later on in the Salt, that's what I would call the watershed of what happened to me as a child, to define the rest of the trauma and the rest of the psychological formation for me. There was an argument between my brother and my mother. My brother was injured in the war, and he came, and that's another story of trauma and screaming my sisters and all that. But just to concentrate on the psychological impact and injury, what happened to me, I want to go back to that argument scene. Because the schools were closed in the face of refugees in East Jordan, in Transjordan at the time. So my brother, who was educated, insisted that he would take us back to Jerusalem, where he has some wasta, or some insiders, to allow us to go to government schools. And my mother was resisting, saying, look, you're not going to take there are no jobs in Jerusalem, there are no construction, my father is a home builder, you're not going to take my children away from me. And that was the defining, probably 3 days, that argument. Every time I go to my counselor therapy, I end up sobbing, and I'm resisting doing it now, because that was the defining scene to subsequently tell me more or less who I am. Because later on, I would live in my brother's household, not realizing that I'm living like an orphan, no matter how loving that is, but my mother and father were missing. And on holidays, I would get up and I'm depressed. I have no idea why I'm depressed. I'm not getting dressed. And I eat. You know, why are you not getting it? And I would be yelled at. And later on, it's only 20, 30 years later, I'd recognize that I was really looking for my mother. So, essentially, I would live this sense of alienation and that kind of deprivation, in a sense, as if, like I was stunted in terms of the receiving of the love that I needed. And it just was never compensated for, to live the rest of my life like that, and in that kind of a sense, stuck in there to some degree. Angry, always very extremely sensitive. I'd cry easily. Always felt just very defensive. The whole thing is just a dysfunction. But the compensation, and also to top it all, I had a sister who was in her teens, who was to come to help my brother's household to take care of us. And she was abusive in language and her own frustration and all that. And I was at the vulnerable age to receive all that garbage. So consequently, it took me years to undo that in therapy, to undo the damage. Let me skip forward. And then essentially, this whole sense of alienation, if it weren't for me being good in school, I mean, that was the whole compensation. If I weren't good in school, I would be a criminal. I would have been a criminal, or I would have been a flunky or whatever. Because my whole self-confidence was eroded, because of my sister and her bad, awful messages. So but I graduated and actually was among the top, people in the matriculation exam. I was fine. And I always got those messages that you're good and so on, which was nice. So I was offered a scholarship by UNRWA in return for, full scholarship to go, the whole thing, to AUB, in return for us to surrender our refugee card, such that we would no longer be classified as refugees. And then we had a family meeting and we said no. Because in Ain Karim, actually, we were fruit growers, and trucks would come and load and so on. And we were, I wouldn't say very wealthy, but we were wealthy. I mean, we had acres and acres of land, fruit trees, grapes, apples, plums, cherries, mishmash, apricots, everything. Lows, everything we had, and so many different orchards. And it's interesting that in 1948 the orchards were really just ripe. They were incredible. That I heard. But also we had olive trees, rows of olive trees all over the place. And of course, my mother was proud to, and she let us know it. She's sort of snobbish because, she comes from a wealthy clan in our town. Our town was half Christian and half Muslims, but she comes from a snobbish, background. And so she would always flaunt saying that, see, because of my good administrative skills, we didn't have to go and live in a refugee camp. So we of course, she brought some money and jewelry and so on, but she didn't bring our birth certificates, for example. Or, I mean, I don't know if they brought the house deeds or maybe she did. But anyhow, we never lived in refugee camps, but the trauma was there in a different way. All the alienation was different.